My name is Jessica McKenzie. I am an associate professor in the Department of Child and Family Science. My background is actually in developmental and cultural psychology. So that's my training, my PhD level training. My official degree is in developmental psychology, but I attended a program that was very culturally informed and culturally oriented. So that you'll see that coming up a lot in our talk today. And so that was, let's see, my PhD, I received that in 2014 and started working here, I guess, a month after I defended my dissertation. Pretty quick transition. And that was from Clark University on the East Coast in Massachusetts. That's where I received my PhD and my master's degree. And I'm from Kentucky. So yeah, so from Kentucky, I did my undergraduate training at Miami University. I was willing to move one state up to be a little far away from my parents, but not too far. So I've been doing this gradual, the gradual opening of distance, I suppose, over the years. It was, I could say it was Thailand that led me to graduate school, which is sort of a strange thing. But I had, in my undergraduate training, I had become really interested in, well, of course, psychology was always my kind of first love, but I became really interested in culture and language. I was studying Italian, which seems strange now, but Italian was my minor. I had lived in Italy for just a little bit and became then really interested in Southeast Asian religions and the ways that religion informs conceptions of self. So it was sort of actually, so it was right after I graduated with my bachelor's degree that I moved to Thailand and became a teacher. So I was sort of, I don't know, a force of globalization, if you will, as an English teacher in this rural village at the first bilingual school in this area. And so it was while I was living in Thailand for that year and a half that I became really interested in things like how religion structures conceptions of self, how globalization affects our modes of sort of being and believing and behaving, our relationships and things like that. So it was really when I was living in Thailand that I realized that I had something that I would want to devote my life to, to studying. And that's when I applied for PhD programs. And then, of course, from there, the dissertation kind of became its own self, its own identity that was built out of that original experience in Thailand. So this year I've been on sabbatical and I've just returned from Thailand, where I was following up with the same adolescents, who are no longer adolescents, they're young adults, about 27 years old. But I interviewed them 10 years ago for my dissertation project. So it's a sort of longitudinal ethnography, looking at both how the village where I had originally studied and the urban city have changed over time, and then kind of looking at this sort of ethnographic contextual change and pairing this with developmental change. And so it was really, just absolutely incredible to track these young people over time and to get to talk with them and to see how, for example, their conceptions of self and religion have changed and also sort of maintained over time. Yes. As I mentioned, my longest standing line of research is in Thailand, and I've been studying the developmental implications of globalization for 10 years. And over the last few years, I've also carved out a research program here in the Central Valley, which we can talk about, if we have time, but let's just see. And that work here in the Central Valley looks at the psychological experiences of biculturalism among ethnic minority youth. And religion, the topic of the day, comes up in both of these lines of work, but I was thinking that since I've been on sabbatical thinking about this, we could start with the Thailand stuff, if that sounds fine. So I'm sharing slides, but just to mention, this is very relaxed. So please feel free to jump in and ask any questions at any time. So as a graduate student, some 10 years ago, I set out to study how exposure to modern globalization broadly speaking, the 3 T's, which would be travel, trade, and technology, how this influences young people's conceptions of morality and self. And this interest was really broadly inspired, as I mentioned previously, as because I myself had served as a sort of globalizing force as an English teacher in a rural Thai village some 6 years before I did my dissertation. So it was sort of a long buildup there, if you will. So for my PhD work, I studied this topic cross-sectionally. So I compared the values and the practices of young people who were growing up in both a rural village and a nearby very globalized urban city. So here you see some pictures. These are pictures of the rural village where I still conduct my research. This is where I returned 10 years later, which was, of course, this year. You see on the left just a picture of the countryside. And on the right, you see some pictures that are pertaining to the topic of the day. So very early on in the course of this research, I mentioned I was interested in how globalization affects and doesn't affect the way that we develop and think about the self and engage in our relationships. And very early on in the course of this research, I realized just how central religion, especially Buddhism, but also including animism, was in people's their daily lives, their value systems, at least in 2012, at least 10 years ago. So nearly every home that we visited, my research assistants and I, you can see in the top right-hand corner, I think. Can you see this, the top right-hand corner? There's an image of one of my research assistants and I, where we were interviewing a Thai individual in their household. And just outside of this house, there was a spirit house. So spirit houses are traditional in Thailand. They can be basic or really ornate, and they honor and protect the guardians of the land and the ancestors. And then when visiting the rural high school where I recruited my participants, you see a picture at the bottom right-hand corner. It doesn't look quite like a high school in that picture, but it is. I was surprised to see that every single morning before the school day began, students, faculty, and staff all sat out together. They gathered underneath these trees on campus that are adorned with Buddhist adages. You could kind of barely see it with an eye shot there. And so they meditated. They meditated in the morning before they began the day of school. So it became really obvious that religion was very much kind of etched into the life course in the rural context. Every Friday morning, a local monk came and visited the school, gave talks, and offered the temple's blessings. So you can see the teachers at the top, at the front, administrators, and then the students toward the back. In the urban context, religion was a little bit less obvious, but it was still present. So you can see on the left-hand side, you can see an image of a stupa. This is a really well-worn stupa that was just at the entryway of campus in the urban globalized environment. And it was within eyeshot of most classrooms. So you can see the classrooms in the back. So when students look out and when they go from one class to the next, they can see the stupa, sort of constant reminder. And also in the urban context, spirit houses were relatively common. So in the right-hand image, you see a house, and then you see actually multiple spirit houses that are just outside. And, you know, in the urban context, what especially struck me 10 years ago was the extent to which parents really tried to encourage religious activities among their children, especially their adolescents, during their free time. So I'll give you just a little example, a story pertaining to the bottom right-hand image here. There was one Saturday that a parent and an adolescent, both of whom I had interviewed several weeks before, invited me to spend the full day with them. And only when they picked me up that day did it become clear that that entire day would be spent carrying multiple watermelons up a very steep mountain to donate to monks who were living in a cave temple that you see here. So it was sort of our way of showing that we were really dedicated to the cause of Buddhism, to carry these watermelons up this very steep mountain. As another example, this is actually a video clip of myself and a Thai family making merit. So what we did is we purchased frogs. I'll go ahead and well, I'll tell you first. So we purchased frogs at a nearby local market, of course, that were being sold for food. Frog curry is very popular in northern Thailand. And so we purchased these frogs, and then we brought the frogs to a nearby river and released them to give them life, make merit for ourselves, for our next lives, and things like this. So here's a quick image. Okay, so we're saying it's funny, they don't want to go in the river. But anyway, so the point here is that in both of these settings, there were these kind of, these frequent, albeit distinct reminders of the centrality of religion for young people, right? So in that image you saw, or in that video you saw a mother, but just the person who was actually taking the video was the adolescent who I had interviewed. So these constant reminders of religion and its role in our lives in ways that are both overt and subtle. So those kinds of experiences really led me to a more specific question, which a portion of my Thailand-based research continues to address, and that is, how is it that religion intersects with youth development in the context of rapidly globalizing northern Thailand? So that's sort of a somewhat more specific question that a portion of my Thailand-based research addresses. And I'll talk a little bit about the ways that I've explored this question. I've explored this question, back in 2012, I explored this question cross-sectionally. So I conducted interviews and observations of adolescents in two settings, right? In a globalized urban city in the north, and then in a nearby rural village. So this village was only 25 miles away. It's actually quite nearby, of course, but we'll see that there are some really interesting and distinct kind of patterns across these contexts with regard to religion. So, so looking at this cross-sectionally, meaning that I was studying in 2012 these two groups of adolescents at the same point in time. So, in working with Fresno State undergraduate students in my research lab, which I love doing, we found that adolescents growing up in the globalized urban city commonly framed their religious practices and beliefs as overlapping with autonomous values. So I'll give you a few kind of examples to bring this to life. So in the urban context, where young people are very exposed to modern globalization, forces of modern globalization, they talked about doing things like making merit, right? Like donating food to monks at the temple, releasing frogs, things like this. But they talked about doing this with the purpose of, for example, getting into a good university, right? So they would say, oh, well, in the past, I haven't really made merit, or it hasn't been that important to me, or Buddhism hasn't been that important to me. But recently I've started making merit so that I can get into the best university possible, right? Or, for example, other adolescents in the urban city said that they've started to make merit because they're thinking that if they do, that they'll be born wealthy in their next life, right? So a sort of very autonomous orientation toward religion. It's not that religion doesn't show up, for sure it does, but it's this kind of independent orientation, a focus on the self. And we're not saying, of course, that this is a bad or a negative thing. I'm not attaching any value judgments, but for sure, this work suggests that this is as a result of their embeddedness in the sort of forces of modern globalization. Now, in contrast, the adolescents growing up in the nearby rural village, they talked about their religious practices and beliefs in ways that overlapped more so with community-driven values. So, for example, adolescents in the rural community talked about making merit with their friends and their family members. So I remember one rural adolescent said, my family, we get chaotic in the temple. It's sort of when you think about your adolescence and what you did and, partying, perhaps things like this, that was sort of their version of partying, right? Of going to the temple and getting chaotic there. So they would commonly go to the temple with family or community members, with their friends. They also made merit on behalf of their family. So some adolescents said, for example, that their parents were too busy working in the rice fields. And so they went to the temple to make merit on behalf of the entire family, right? Or other adolescents who had temporarily ordained as a monk, which is a common kind of part of the life course, at least historically for Thai youth, for men specifically, boys. Some of them expressed that they were temporarily a monk because they were honoring their deceased ancestors. So really, in this rural context, religion was fundamentally relational in a way that it wasn't in the urban, more globalized context. So the point here, from a kind of qualitative perspective, is that even though we see religion showing up in both contexts, like we saw in those images, that its meaning varies and differs quite a bit for in the minds of young people growing up across these two contexts, which again are only separated by 25 miles. So when I use the word divinity, broadly speaking, so there's, in the field of developmental and cultural psychology, there's a framework called the cultural developmental approach. And it's based on decades of psychological and anthropological, sociological research. And it suggests that essentially, when we think about the moral self, right, and moral development, that we need to kind of broaden our scope of how we think about morality. So a lot of moral psychology traditionally has looked at kind of one layer of moral selfhood, things like justice and fairness, kind of Western notions that, you know, kind of grounded in Lawrence Kohlberg and Piaget and all of these people from decades ago. This idea that the most sort of advanced moral thinking is moral thinking that really prioritizes things, concerns about fairness, justice, freedom, kind of autonomous values. And so the cultural developmental approach includes a different additional sets of values. So autonomy is one set, community would be another set, and divinity is another set. Now, when you say that, that still sounds kind of prescriptive, like what you're saying, right? So how do we calibrate these sorts of meaning systems to the people that we're studying? And so that's another layer. So when, for example, engaging in coding or developing coding schemes, oftentimes we would take these three kind of broad categories and come up with coding systems that are indigenous to the community, right? So we work with these three broad categories as sort of meaning systems with an openness to thinking about how they overlap, how they show up. So of course, you know, the codes for divinity look different for sure than they do when we're doing, you know, when I'm coding interviews or observations in more, you know, kind of traditionally Christian contexts, because of course there's not a single God. Although Thailand is complicated, you know, we know that in Buddhism there's not a single God, but I think psychologically speaking, people like to be able to point to a person. And so in the Thai context, you oftentimes see that people kind of will treat Buddha as though Buddha is godlike, really. So,
and you said also there, so this is like, this framework is Western academic framework that you're sort of employing with Kohlberg and these other models.
Oh no, I'm kind of anti-Kohlberg. Well, I don't want to say I'm anti-Kohlberg, but it's the cultural developmental framework takes some research from the sort of Kohlberg and this sort of these Western norms, but then it also works with decades of research in India and around the world. So it's really a framework that's being used in multiple locations. So it's not it creates space to calibrate what the meaning of these concepts are, like what the meaning of divinity is, for example, in various locations. So it's sort of moving between, I don't know if you use this language in philosophy, but like emic and etic kind of approaches to how we think about psychological development and moral development. And yeah, so for me, even though, so when I think about things like divinity in the Thai context, I would ask questions like, what does divinity mean in the Thai context, and how does that show up? What are the other value systems that are paired alongside it, and what does that reveal about the way that we think about religion, spirituality, and the divine in our development?
Hmm. Well, so then I understand how you're explaining this. So then a question about the globalized urban
Mm,
autonomous, maybe, I mean, you said you don't want to have a value judgment, but kind of self-interested, right? Like it's about
mm,
you want to get into a good college or something, as you said.
mm.
Um, that's because the context in which they're in, like the standards, the criteria, the value scheme is oriented towards personal achievement. It's
Of
capitalism, right?
course.
Like you got
Yes,
to make money in the
exactly.
city, and then to do that, you got to get into university.
It's more psychologically adaptive, right? So
Okay,
if
yeah.
we're going to take divinity, the divine, religion, spirituality, if these things are still going to be embedded in our lives, then we need to take it and kind of tailor it for exactly as you mentioned, for sort of a capitalistic, society in which we need to survive and to thrive and to have um, a lot of money and so forth. So exactly, that's exactly it. So it's sort of tailoring these local meaning systems in a way that kind of fit into their context, which has changed, of course, quite a lot over the last generation. It's so interesting. You're reminding me that there's some work where really interesting work in looking at cultural learning models and learning beliefs. It's a different kind of course, line of research than what I study, but it's very cool. And it's Jin Lee is her name. She's really interesting. She kind of has a philosophical orientation as well. And in her work, not only does she interview people, but she will also like have someone listen to someone else, their response, so someone else in another location. So for example, a European American parent might listen to an East Asian parent's response to a discipline tactic, right, and ask how they respond to that and what they think about that. And so this sort of, you're making me think about this, about how cool it would be to actually not only have us assess these sort of things in our own lives, but also consider whether they may be value judgments or sort of from within a single nation. I love that idea. That's very cool.
But you didn't ask that question, or you didn't study.
I didn't ask that question, but I mean, I will say that so this is the cross-sectional piece 10 years later, right? This year I did when I went back. And that's, we can turn to that at some point. I do have some more slides on the longitudinal piece, but there was quite a lot of movement. The urban youth were had commonly either stayed in the urban environment or moved to an even more urban environment. So Bangkok, the city or the capital of Thailand. Some of them, a handful of them, had actually moved abroad and they lived abroad. And so really they had pursued opportunities that had kind of even extended and expanded their experience in, this sort of modern globalization, if you will. The rural adolescents, there was only one rural adolescent who had 10 years later who had moved abroad, and they had moved to Korea to work and to earn money in order to send back to their parents. They were there, not fully legally, so they were in a really precarious position, a very different position, for example, than the urban youth who had moved, to Germany to be an au pair or something like this. So they were much more likely to either be still in the rural area, or they had moved. If they moved to the city, usually they moved to the nearby city, the nearby globalized city. So they were living in Chiang Mai rather than in Bangkok. And it would be, it's hard with a smallish sample size. It's hard to talk about, broad scale trends among just a few people who had moved to an urban, from a rural to an urban environment. But it's a really interesting question and a sort of qualitative gaze that I think would be interesting to follow up on and to think about how their perspectives have changed. Just anecdotally, I guess, of the interviews that we conducted with the rural youth who had moved to the nearby urban city 25 miles away, many of them seemed to endorse kind of more, like they would oftentimes talk about religion in a way that was not quite as relational, that was different than they had talked about it before, that was a little bit closer to, not exactly the same, but a little bit closer to the sort of more autonomous version of divinity that we saw among the youth in the globalized city 10 years ago. So I suspect that there is, on the one hand, some influence of sort of movement, but another kind of thing that we can talk about in a moment that we see a lot is that the influence of early socialization is also really powerful, right? So even there were a few rural youth who moved actually to Bangkok, the biggest city, and they still really held a sort of community-driven, filial piety-oriented, kind of collectivistic, if you will, without being too generalized, orientation toward the life course. Even though they were living in an urban city, the way that they approached the urban city was quite a bit different than the way that the young people who had grown up in this more globalized city approached their lives, if that makes sense. So yeah, in my work in the Central Valley, I've looked, for example, at the way in which religion shows up and how ethnically diverse, especially Hmong American and Mexican American emerging adults, so Fresno State students, most of them, talk about religion. So how religious they feel that they are, their religious affiliations. And one thing that's coming up, and looking specifically at how religion intersects with ethnic and cultural identity development among our students. And what you're saying is tapping into one of the core themes that's been emerging in that work that I've been conducting with an honors student over the last few years, which is, I think, really interesting and really pressing for us as faculty members thinking about supporting our students. So a lot of our students, especially the Hmong American students, from what I've from these interviews, talk about the sort of tension between like autonomous American values that they are exposed to, especially in higher education, and kind of collectivistic, broadly speaking, values to which they're exposed at home. And a lot of them talk about real challenges that they encounter. Like, for example, I'm remembering there was one interviewee who was a graduate student, and he was a straight A student. He was, I don't want to give too much away, but this was a really top-notch student. And he shared with me that he had earned 1B in graduate school, and that was ironically from his like a multicultural class. And the reason why it was ironic is because this multicultural class, the professor was assigning points based on participation. And so in his Hmong household, he was, of course, taught to be humble and to speak when spoken to, and these sorts of things. And so not to sort of assert his opinion and be really dominant, if you will, in the conversation. And he took these values into the school system at Fresno State, and then his professor is docking him points because he's not speaking up enough, right? And so I think one thing in thinking about kind of the tension between, I don't know if it's rural and urban, or if it's really just broadly speaking, the sort of different cultures that we inhabit and that we're expected to just automatically calibrate to, when we go from home to school. I think especially for ethnic minority youth, but it's not only for ethnic minority youth, that this is really creates actually a lot of tension, right? About frame switching and how do we do this? And is this positive or negative? And I think as faculty members, we oftentimes don't think about how we may be unwittingly kind of adding on to these sorts of this taxation, this kind of psychological burden of having to kind of hold these two value systems and not being able to and really saying this is the one that we like and we don't like this other one, even though we say that it's a multicultural class and we value cultural diversity. But how are the things in which we're, the ways that we're behaving actually directly contradictory to those value systems? I think that I have to be agnostic, right? I think that if I were to, maybe I don't have to be, but I think as a as an analyst, I think it's important that I don't go in with, I'm working from the ground up, right? Trying to learn people's perspectives and their psychological orientations rather than sort of the top down and saying, yeah, do away with this sort of thing. But of course, I'm a human and I have perspectives. Yeah, I think, one question that I was thinking you were asking about like the purpose of this kind of research and ethical goals and things like this, and the questions that you would pose. And one thing that I was thinking about and preparing for today was, in the Thai context and around the world, we oftentimes think about things like unfettered globalization as great equalizers, like even digital media, right? And even in popular discourse, we think about digital media expansion and intrusion as, a great equalizer, that it equalizes everything. Western style schooling is a sort of ticket to freedom, right? We think about all of these things as positive, and maybe we don't mean to, but I think we kind of see this discourse saturated in our society and really around the world too, right? That these sorts of things, capitalism, increasing embeddedness in market economies, right? Increasing GDP, all of this stuff sounds good on the surface, right? It seems like it's making our lives better, but I do think that for me, one kind of important question that it raises about that this work raises is that we have to ask what the costs are, right? In terms of how might these forces erode Indigenous belief systems and practices that are actually psychologically protective. So, for example, and this is anecdotal, this is nothing that's published yet, but in this follow-up research in Thailand this year that I was engaging in, I was really baffled, frankly, by something that kept coming up, especially among the young people who were reared in the globalized urban context, that they were really, they had experienced severe depression, that they had experienced suicidal ideation, that they were very anxious. And so, of course, we can't extrapolate and say that it's, that living in this, this globalized urban context that makes them more autonomous, which, this research very clearly shows that then, and then the decrease of kind of community-driven values and filial piety and things like this, that of course leads to psychological problems, right? And sort of maladaptive processes. But I do think that it's something for us to consider, right? About how forces of globalization alter the way that we think about the self and alter our Indigenous belief systems in ways that may actually kind of open us up to problems, right? And things that we miss out on, the sort of relational orientation, for example, toward life and toward religion that we tend to still see in the rural context. So it worries me a little bit. In the local research here in the Central Valley, when I interview Hmong American and Mexican American participants, the first thing that we do when we begin our conversation is I give them a blank piece of paper and I say, I know that this sounds really crazy and kind of childish, but will you just draw what it means to be Hmong American, right? And then I leave them alone. I get tea and stuff like this, and I bring it back to them 10 minutes later. And really, the things that come up are really deep and layered and speak to a lot of things about kind of how we psychologically orient ourselves toward this sort of process of managing multiple cultural identities that you just mentioned. And so this is one participant who, the reason why I'm sharing this with you is because, there's a lot here, okay, but the layer that's sort of in the cloud, on the upper right-hand side, and this participant is, looking cross-eyed between two different value systems, right? One, of course, is the American value system symbolized by the flag, but also symbolized by Christianity, right? And on the other side, we see essentially shamanistic practices, right? So for him, for this participant, and for so many other participants, this feeling of being caught between two worlds it's really, religion is a core piece of this, right? Religion sort of suffuses American culture. And of course, it's reified in all sorts of ways, but this sort of experience of biculturalism, I think problematically in the psychological literature, we oftentimes talk about biculturalism as purely or mostly advantageous, right? So there's a lot of research that shows that young people who endorse both their heritage cultural values and American cultural values are well adjusted, that they're psychologically and physically healthier. I mean, it's all just this sort of quantitative research that says and sings the praises of being bicultural. And even at the university, we talk about cultural diversity and in ways that are just, we're all one big happy family. But when we really start looking at this a little bit deeper, and we don't even have to ask that complicated of a question, right, to our students and to participants, we see that the sort of lived experience of living these dual worlds creates really a lot of tension. And so, yeah, for sure we see this. For sure, we see this in the local research, and to some extent, this global research as well. The sort of feeling of living betwixt and between a sort of value systems, Thai value systems that directly contradict or conflict with global value systems that come in part from the US, but also from many other forces, right, from other Asian countries and so forth, that can be psychologically burdensome as well. I mean, I think that there are different ways of answering that question, and I'm trying to think about how to answer it. I think, I think on the most basic level, the goal for me is to diversify developmental science. I know that sounds really broad and kind of also cheesy, but this discipline, developmental psychology, developmental science more generally, really has long operated with this kind of assumption that there's like a single healthy way of developing. If you look at exams that are given, even in among faculty members who are really devoted to this kind of thing, who believe that they're prioritizing diversity and so forth, a lot of exam questions are written in a way where there's one healthy way of developing, or there's one and it should look like this, which are and the sort of way that things should look are really based on, as we would say, weird Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic nations, and especially on European Americans within those contexts. So I think one broad goal is just really to diversify developmental science and to kind of expand beyond and push the sort of buttons of these kind of dominant discourses. I think another, thinking specifically about the religion piece, another goal, another reason why I think that we should study this stuff is that there are really these rooted academic norms in psychology of pushing religion aside as though it's exclusively sociological or philosophical, right? That this idea that religion doesn't belong in psychology because it can't be studied objectively, right? Which of course there's a question, can anything be studied truly objectively? And as my work and the work of some other cultural psychologists shows, it's really, religion is really core to so many developmental processes: identity development, cultural identity development, moral development. And so if we're ignoring religion, it's not only peculiar, I think it's also kind of dangerous, right? And it's unfortunately still a practice that we see in the field. And then I guess just, on the most local level, kind of also perhaps sounds cheesy, but since working at Fresno State, another goal that I have is to have students see themselves in developmental science, right? Like students need to see themselves in the things that we're teaching. And I realized very early on that that's not often the case. If you use textbooks, right? Textbooks are notoriously problematic, kind of for sort of reinforcing this idea that there's one healthy way of being an adolescent, for example, or that there's one healthy way of designing family structures. And so for me, a goal that I've had is also allowing students it's not even an honor or privilege, it's just the basic human thing of having themselves seen and seeing themselves in their work. I've had students, come up after a class and say, for example, Hmong American students, I've never actually talked about, like I've talked about Asians in my other classes, but never about my culture, Hmong culture. Like, thank you so much for talking about this. Thank you for having a unit on Hmong conceptions of development. It's like, wow, that's wild, isn't it? If our student body is so Hmong and we are just not talking about it, or we're kind of glossing over it by putting them in a big box along with other Asians. So yeah, I think, I don't know. Yeah, maybe those goals sound small. On the one hand, most social scientists are agnostic or atheist, right? Of course, this is a generalization, and I realize this, but generally speaking, right, academics and these disciplines tend not to be very religious themselves, right? So religion doesn't tend to come up, you've heard this phrase, research is me search. And so if you want to study and research something that is about you, basically, because we're, self-centered on some level, then that's not going to show up. So I think on some level, it's kind of just a product of the inherent subjectivity of social science, right? That we study things that are interesting to us. And if we're not religious, we're not going to study it. But then on the other hand, I think it's really this sort of this remaining problem of prioritizing quantitative, objective truths, or truth, I guess, with a single capital T, in social science. Or no, I can't say social science. I can say psychology. It's still very much the dominant paradigm still remains very much to think about and study things that are objective, study objectively, study quantitatively. And it's really hard to get at religion in a way that's purely quantitative, right? We can look at things like, how many times people go to the temple or to church. And that's something that's sort of interesting, but it's not really interesting in the end, is it? It's like, if we're trying to understand meaning systems, then we need to look at things qualitatively. So I think it's sort of also a product, unfortunately, of graduate school training that emphasizes, speed of producing and publishing, and that you only get fast publications if you do things quantitatively, really, right? Because qualitative stuff takes a long time and a lot of investment. And so, oh, hi, Kat. And so, so I think, I don't know. Do you have an impression? I think that those are two explanations that come to my mind.
Yeah, no, and I think, it's, like behaviorism in the social sciences and in psychology is easy in a sense.
Yes.
Obviously, it's not easy, right? But the difficult thing is, how do you get to the inside of someone's experience, right? And ultimately, it's ultimately like biographical, right? How do you really, this is the problem of ethics. How do you judge someone's character? How do you really know what's going on internally? And then how do you judge someone's religiosity? Or how do we, what scale would we use? I think that's a problem.
So yes, how do you get to the inside? That's such a good question.
Yeah.
It's the only question that interests me, really, but I think it's oh man, you get so much pushback with that, wouldn't you? in the US context, at least, because it would seem too overt, too religious, something like this. But I guess meditation is framed as something that's not religious in the US context, even though, of course, in much of the world it is. I don't know. I don't know to what extent it informs the way that education takes shape, but I do know that something that kept showing up in these in this rural community, especially with kind of conceptions of self and divinity, is that it because, as you saw in those pictures, it was the meditation is something that's oftentimes framed as individual, right? Like, you sit in your room, you have a little meditation corner in your house, and you do it 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 20 minutes in the morning, right? And so I think in the Western world, we oftentimes think about and frame meditation as something, or prayer. I mean, even if you go to the temple, something, or go to the church, something like this, we oftentimes think about prayer, meditation as something that's individualized. But in the rural context, for sure, the fact that, it was all of the staff, the administrators, and the students all together collectively meditating, I think it reinforces an orientation toward not just religion and divinity, but also kind of humanity, that is kind of emphasizes and reinforces the relational interdependence of us all. And that's also, of course, fundamentally Buddhist. So I don't know if it's, if it's overtly, if it's religion itself and the sort of practice of meditation, or if it's the way that it's done in a way that is sort of more broadly emphasizing this interdependence that really kind of seeps into the crevices of the way that we think about self. And that, of course, it probably will also influence the way that our education takes shape. I don't know. I mean, just generally, people are very welcome to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to kind of direct you in various ways. There's one person that that's coming to mind that I really admire, who studies from an anthropological, sort of psychological perspective, the ways in which religion shows up in really really interesting ways. Julia Casanidi is her name. Julia Casanidi. She also does research in Thailand. And so I would recommend that people would look her up, Julia Casanidi's work. She's extended beyond Thailand at this point, but a lot of her work is based in Thailand, and I think she would be useful. Of course, I also have a website. It's just www.jessica-mckenzie.com, and so people could look at, I post articles that are published, and kind of projects that I'm working on and my students are working on there, so they're welcome to do this. And then I'll give some thought to other resources that might be helpful. But really, I would just say that people are very welcome to reach out to me, jmckenzie@csufresno.edu. And I love, for me, talking to students is probably one of my very favorite things to do. So even if they're not housed within CFS, I would be happy to talk and to kind of explore ideas together.